Hello, my name is Nick Hopwood. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and I work in the School of Education. This is a short video for the Designing Research Lab here at UTS, but we hope it'll be useful to anybody who's interested in social science and arts research. This video focuses on what we call activist or change-oriented methodologies. Firstly, let's think just what do we mean by these terms? Well, obviously, most research wants to make a positive difference to the world, whether that be laboratory science, medical research, engineering, even mathematics or history. They're all trying to do something to improve the world in some way, even if that's at the level of our understanding of an issue or a problem or an aspect of society. Activist research is about actually trying to change the material conditions for people or particular places. And it goes one step further than, say, cultural critique, which is research with kind of a political conviction, but actually doesn't deliver changes directly. And that's a view of activist research which comes from Charles Hale, which I think is very useful. So he says that he defines activist research as about trying to understand the root causes of things like inequality, oppression, and violence. Or I would add a specific problem in practice or a professional practice setting. Often from the start to the end, it involves working with other people who are affected by those conditions of inequality or injustice, or those people affected by a practice problem. So it's often very collaborative, but not necessarily always. And the important thing is that activist research formulates strategies to make a difference to the conditions, to transform or transcend the conditions which create a problem in the world, or to resolve a practical problem, which could be a problem relating to behaviour management in a classroom, or how to deliver an IT update in a company, or something like that. Now, the picture on the top right here of the worm is from a resource around activist research that's relating to environmentalism and the idea of degrowth and research that can kind of counter the hegemonic idea that economic growth is important and necessary. This is a really important point or assumption that underpins all change-oriented or activist methodologies, which is research does not have to be politically neutral in order to be good. In fact, you can do very rigorous scientific or scholarly research on a problem and at the same time hold and pursue a political commitment, a commitment to a better kind of a world, a commitment to more efficient or improved professional practice, a commitment to enhanced health outcomes in a community, or a more just set of relationships between groups in society. So it's challenging the idea that research should be objective, if objective means politically neutral. Now, this is somebody I admire a lot, Anna Stetsenko, and she writes recently in her book 2017 about a transformative activist stance. And this is interesting because this suggests that in our everyday acts, we're implicated in broader social change or inertia, that we make history and our common future. We bear responsibility for what happens today and therefore what happens for tomorrow. Yes, there are social structures like race and class and gender, and they exist before we take a particular action. But it's what we do, or as Anna says, what we don't do, that helps maintain those structures or perhaps can transform and transcend them. So she's trying to argue against this feeling that people can have that we're just tiny fish in this huge ocean and these big social structures are out there independent of us and there's nothing we can do about them. She says, yes, they're out there, but our actions create them. And because of that, therefore our actions or inactions sustain them, and our actions and inactions can start to transform or transcend them. Now, there are many different ways of doing activist or change-oriented research, and I'll focus on three in this presentation, but it's important to think about many. There's what many people call participatory action research, or collaborative action research, or community participatory action research. This is one where the project involves collaboration with others, not only in the point of involving them in aspects of the design, but in ownership of the research. And those others could be communities, it could be other practitioners, it could be students, all sorts of people. There are decolonizing methodologies, and in this subject designing research lab, that's covered quite separately. And they're recognizing that current academic practices, including publishing and ethics and the way funding is distributed and the kinds of knowledge that are valued and legitimized and the kind of outputs, the ways of representing knowledge, for example, in journal articles, perpetuate colonizing forces that create structural inequalities and unfairly and wrongly overlook or even sideline or seek to discount or discredit or silence particular ways of understanding the world and changing those understandings. And so they take very seriously indigenous or non-Western methodologies and knowledges. There are feminist methodologies, which often point to biases in the way that research is done, as well as gendered issues in society. And they think very carefully about researcher positionality and often focus on issues to do with diversity. And one does not have to be studying something to do with women to take a feminist methodology, nor does one have to be a woman. There is militant research, which could be research that's actively with and kind of forwarding a particular social movement or revolution. And I'm going to mention here change laboratories, otherwise known as developmental work research, or DWR, which comes from cultural historical activity theory, and that now has a move towards alternatives to capitalism. Now, there are other examples. There are design experiments and many others, so this is not a claim to be exhaustive. I put on the right there about practice-based approaches. They can also have a change-oriented component, and they're one of the three that I'll talk about in a bit more detail. So, action research. Some people would associate it with John Dewey in the early 20th century in the US, and often this man whose picture is there on the right, Kurt Lewin, who said no research, no action without research, and no research without action. And action research is important because it legitimizes and values the ideas of reflective thought, discussion, and decision by, and the old language used to be ordinary people, but I don't like that idea because I think we're either all ordinary or, more preferably, we're all extraordinary. But what it meant was people who weren't ordinarily involved in the pursuit of social research. And they participate in research collectively on shared problems. Now, action research is typically an iterative process. You don't just kind of try one thing out and then see if it works, but you have multiple cycles of planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. And they're often talked about as action spirals, and you can kind of see two representations of that here on this slide. Often action research these days tends to emphasise the degree and nature of participation more, and often has quite a critical aspect to it. And important here was the work of Paulo Freire, an educationalist from South America, on social transformation and how person-to-person dialogue can do this. And there are lots of variants and variations in action research these days, but it's gone beyond the idea of a person perhaps working on their own practice, like a teacher could do some action research to try and deal with a behaviour management problem or a particular tricky aspect of learning. That's still legitimised and respected and valued. But there are also more group-based forms of action research, and the idea of critical action research is that it addresses these structural things that shape and influence, often unfairly, the way society works, and so focus on social transformation rather than just practical problems. Now, the change laboratory, or developmental work research, this was developed by Yrjö Ungerström and Virkunen and others in Finland, and initially was associated with third generation activity theory and now fourth generation activity theory, which is increasingly around alternatives to capitalism. It has its roots in the theory of Marx, who Marxism is often, it is a strong kind of revolutionary, if you like, activist theory of the world, particularly a theory around capitalism and the kind of unfairness and the contradictions within it. And what Engstrom took from Marx was the idea that contradictions between elements of a system are the driving force of change. The direction for change, the need for change, the energy for change, all come from contradictions in a system. And in any kind of long-standing system, we would expect there to be contradictions. And there's a cycle where we look at the situation, we analyse it, and I'll say more about how this is done, create a model, test it, implement it, and then kind of reify it in the sense of embed it in practices, codes, procedures, and artifacts and things. Now, the Change Laboratory has particularly been looking at problems in workplaces, but they could be health settings and hospitals, schools or universities, agriculture, factories, IT companies, law firms, many different kinds of systems. Now, in the Change Laboratory, firstly, you need to recognise the need for change. And then what happens is the collection and analysis of mirror data. And this often involves videos or observations of people doing work, interviews with people who are involved in this system in some way, gathering stories about what happens. It could be customer feedback or feedback from patients if it's a health system, or students if it's in education, and lots of looking at existing statistics, documents, and data that already exists about how the system works. And then what you do is you map the system, you explore the system. This is what this triangle on the left looks like in terms of those different components. The subjects, who are the people working here, the tools, the ideas, artifacts, resources that they use, the rules, whether they're formal, like you are and aren't allowed to do this, or informal, like cultural accepted ways of doing things, procedures and regulations. There's the community, others who have a stake and are involved in some way, and the division of labour, which means the roles, who does what. The object is the thing you're working on or trying to improve, and the outcome is the change or the impact that improvement would deliver. Now, let's imagine that, I was involved in one kind of version of this Change Laboratory, a very simple version, where we were interested in how PhD students got teaching opportunities within a university. And so the system involved rules around who was allowed to teach, so whether you had to have completed a course or not. It involved the community, which would have been students, PhD students wanting to teach them, academics, and others invested in the university, administrators, things like that. The division of labour was really the issue here, which was who does what, how do teaching roles get assigned? Now, the object was really PhD students' development and learning as an academic, and the outcomes would be their better preparation for academic work after a PhD by having been involved in teaching at the university. The tools involved and the resources were things like guides to particular ways of running lectures or tutorials, as well as lists of students who expressed an interest in teaching or lists of teaching opportunities. What we were able to do was map a contradiction and see that some of these rules were in contradiction with the division of labour, or some of the tools were in contradiction with, say, the rules. So there might be a long list of students wanting to express interest in teaching, but the rules didn't necessarily mean that all those students on the list could teach. So what we did was we then had to identify those contradictions and then plan or develop a new model that would resolve those. So that might involve changing the rules or changing the tools that are involved or changing the division of labour, the roles, and then implement that, see if it worked, and then embed that in the university. And that's exactly what we did. Now, we didn't do a full Change Laboratory, but we used the principles of it. Now, this diagram on the right is essentially a map of how a Change Lab session works, which is when researchers and the people involved, the participants, sit around and they look at models using the activity system as one model. They look at present, past and future ideas and tools, and they look at the mirror data. And there are all sorts of information available to them. And you can in fact see a live version of that on the right here on this book cover, which exactly has that kind of layout that's described in this conceptual model here. Now, practice-based studies, they can be quite descriptive, but they can also be oriented to change, not necessarily large social change in terms of structural inequalities, but particularly around one's own practice or professional practice setting. And what I think practice-based studies offer is a new set of eyes for which to see or notice a particular practice, and then new ways of interpreting the significance of what you notice. They tend to be naturalistic, looking at what people are already doing, rather than, say, action research, which actually tries to change the practice. Practice-based studies will look at practices as they already are, but in the way of doing that, there comes change. If you're not able to observe, there is something you can use called the interview to the double, which has been kind of resurrected by Davide Niccolini from the University of Warwick, which involves a particular way of asking people about their work so that you get a very unusual but important description that includes lots of things that might otherwise have been overlooked. By understanding practice in these new ways, new possibilities for change arise, and I think that taps back into that quote from Stetsenko about how our actions or inactions are implicated in social transformation or the change in the world that we might want to see. So what do these new eyes look like? Well, in a practice-based study, we pay very close attention to bodies. We're not just brains at work, but we're human bodies. Male and female, young and old, various different race or ethnic bodies, these matter. But also how we hold and touch and move, and the use of our voice. Are we speaking fast or slow, loud or soft? All these kinds of things. There are aesthetics, and Sylvia's partner Antonio Strati has done a lot around this. And they particularly convey the aesthetics of builders working on a roof in one study they did. How you balance on the roof, but also, and this connects with bodies, but how you, if you're to pass something heavy to somebody who's also standing on a sharply angled roof, you have to anticipate how they're going to receive it and how it'll affect their balance. There are studies of anaesthetists at work and the aesthetics of how you move around, anticipate what's coming, pass instruments around in surgery, how you exert pressure on parts of the body during surgery and get feedback. Now, the materialities, the stuff of practice, the objects, and they're not just tools used, or like a room would be a container for practice, but they're seen to exert force. And when you think about what force objects might have, what they can make people do, or how they shape what people do, that's a key thing about practice-based studies. And you certainly get a new understanding of practices and how you might change them. Now, there are things to do with rhythms, the pace of work, repetition and difference. What happens the same, but everything happens similarly. It's never exactly the same. So you become very sensitive to repetition and difference. And Sylvia, in particular, Gerardi, is very keen on this idea of knowing, rather than thinking about practice in terms of knowledge, which we then do in our practice or put to work. Thinking about knowing. Knowledge isn't something that we have only, but something that we do. And it's not something we do alone, but we do it together. And in that doing, that implies our physical bodies, aesthetic judgments, the material objects around us, and things to do with pace and rhythms. So in a practice-based study, you become sensitive to all sorts of things in practice that are often overlooked, and nothing is too mundane or boring or everyday to be ruled out at the start. We remain open to what might be important in practice. And the whole point is that through these new eyes, looking at bodies, aesthetics, materiality, rhythms, and knowing rather than knowledge, new possibilities for change in practice arise. So, in summary, there are lots of different ways to make a concrete difference to the world through the act of research itself, rather than just through findings that then have an implication for a change. And things to think about if you're thinking about designing activist or change-based research is what kinds of collaboration or participation with others will be involved. In what ways might your research identify the root causes of a problem and not just a sticking plaster over the top? What are the implications of everyday acts in wider social transformations or transformations in workplaces? What kind of action are you thinking of? What kind of activism, political commitment? What kind of change? And to remember that being political in research, according to these methodologies, does not negate being robust and scholarly. We can be both. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. Please feel free to leave comments on the YouTube comments function underneath. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.